Hello and welcome back to the DIY hosting of an email server video series. In this video, the 7th bonus video in the series, we have a quick look at a few ways we can debug Postfix and Dovecot in order to identify problems as efficiently as possible, using various tools that we have at our disposal to help us narrow down our search if things aren't working properly. I think this would be useful for anybody who's been following along with the course, and maybe this video is a bit late in arriving, but it's particularly useful for those who might be having a bit of difficulty with their transition to using SNI and virtual mailboxes. Okay, so let's get cracking, but of course before we do, you know the score. I have a Patreon account. If you'd like access to videos as much as a couple of months early, particularly on long series like this, would like to get one-to-one support with me relating to the course, or would just like to support my work to say thanks, please do check out my Patreon account. It's because of my patrons that I'm actually continuing with this, as it takes a lot of my time. So please do if you're interested. Thanks. Right, so there are 6 steps I have recently been taking when debugging my server and when confirming my email server and the users of that email server are configured correctly. I was doing this passively. I didn't realize I was doing these things every time almost, but I am, so I thought it would be a good idea to write a list so that those who are having difficulty can very quickly make use of these things as well. Setting up email servers is fraught with issues, and this might help you find solutions much more quickly. So it goes as follows. Let's whip through this quickly and then we'll go over to the desktop afterwards and I will demonstrate how it all works. The first one is the obvious one. Check the status of the server. We know how to do this already with the status command, but it is an essential first step. Whenever you make any changes, you always must check the status of both Postfix and Dovecot to make sure they're both running. The second one is checking the logs. Again, it sounds obvious, but a lot of people don't seem to do it. If you're having trouble, check the logs. I will show you where they are and how easy it is to check the logs and find out what's going on. Number 3, use the Dovecot admin tool. This is a fantastic tool when you set up virtual users to check that Dovecot has picked up and recognizes those virtual users correctly and that the permissions assigned are correct. It's a great tool giving you confidence if there is an issue, it doesn't lie there. Or if there is an issue, you'll find it straight away with users. Number 4 is using the Telnet tool. We've been here before, but it's a valuable asset that you should use because the Telnet tool will allow us to check that our IMAP authentication is working by logging in with your virtual users to your mailboxes. This is a really useful thing to do. It allows us to know that locally IMAP is functioning as it should and it's understanding the virtual user authentication. And number 5 is using the mail and MUT tools to confirm that SMTP is working correctly and that mailboxes are also configured correctly and are picking up emails. So mail and MUT allow us to send and view emails very easily from the command line, and it's a great way of checking internally that SMTP is working. It again starts ruling out possible points of failure when you're trying to debug things with SMTP. Then finally, of course, there's connecting with an email client externally to check that IMAP is working by being able to view your inbox folders, which is a good test for IMAP, but also folder permissions, because you wouldn't be able to connect if the permissions weren't right. And then send emails from the client, which is a good test for SMTP via an IMAP connection. So that's the list. Let me now show this in action by heading over to my desktop and I'll demonstrate these points. Right, so here we are on my desktop then. I'm going to SSH into my Raspberry Pi as normal with my SSH alias Pi. Okay, right, so here we are in my bash terminal. So firstly, let's address point 1 just to complete the picture, even though we know how to do this. With Postfix and Dovecot running, it's always a good idea to check their status, and we do that with sudo service postfix status, and then you can use a semicolon and do the same for Dovecot, or you could keep them separate, which I will do here. So you press enter, and what you're looking for is an active and exited green state here, which suggests everything's working as it should. And then I'll use the up key on my keyboard just to change Postfix to Dovecot so that we can quickly see how Dovecot's doing. And again, we've got active and running up here. Worth noting, I've mentioned it before, do not worry about the rubbish that you get here. This is basically somebody trying to brute force their way into my server. They will never be able to, but this is their attempt to just see how open weak my system is. So that's fine. Don't worry about that. You'll almost certainly have these kind of attempts at getting into your server. I'm afraid you can't avoid it. Okay, right, so on to point 2 then, which are the logs. Now, the default logging of Postfix and Dovecot is actually quite good. You can make them more verbose if you like, and I'll leave that up to you to search for, but typically the logs actually contain most of the information you will need anyway. So for me, and very likely for you, the logs can be located as follows. There's one for info and one for error that I particularly pay attention to. I suggest you make a note of these, as it will save you time in the future when you are going to want to look at what's causing issues. So I'll just clear my screen to stay organized, and I'll now type in tail just to get the bottom of the log, which is where the recent values are, /var/log, sorry, values, I mean entries, /var/log/mail dot, and then as I say, there's info and error. So if I go to info first, click enter, I'm going to get various pieces of information telling me about connections. Now, because my server isn't failing, there are no major issues, I'm not getting any errors. But what I want to demonstrate here in particular is that you get both Postfix and indeed Dovecot messages in this mail log file. So it's a very useful place for checking what's going on and what's going wrong, if something is going wrong. So make a note. This is a very quick command that you can use to get this information. Equivalently, we can do the same for error, and we can see what errors there have been. You can see there are some issues, or have been some issues yesterday. This is probably me when I was messing with the system. So they're all yesterday, so it doesn't really matter. Yes, it would have been me at this time in the evening. So yeah, so this is how you do it. And again, it'll tell you whether it's Dovecot or Postfix that's causing the issue. So it's a great way of very quickly seeing an error state, and it should be quite a useful message that tells you what the problem is and will allow you to try and go and fix it. So this should be in your armory at all times if you're having trouble with your server. Okay, so on to the third thing then, which is using the Dovecot admin command to check that virtual users are configured correctly. Now this is a great test to rule out issues associated with your user authentication. This is particularly a lifesaver for those using and setting up virtual mailboxes, as it allows us to confirm that the setup you have for your virtual mailboxes have been picked up correctly by Dovecot, and therefore the user setup isn't a source of issue. It's something worth doing actually every time you create a new user. Incidentally, on that point, I'll cover how to efficiently create new users, new virtual users in particular, in a later bonus video. Okay, so to check a user is picked up properly by Dovecot, we do the following, and it's very simple. Type as I type. Clear my screen. Sudo dov adm, so sudo to elevate permissions, dov adm space user, because the Dovecot admin command is user, and then we need to type a user in. So for you it will be different, but for me it is bob@single-entity.com. Remembering that we have to provide a fully qualified domain name when we refer to a user when using virtual mailboxes and virtual users. I press enter. Okay. So what you should get is a message showing that the user and group ID are 5000, which we can see here. This is because in the setup I've demonstrated, we use group and user ID 5000 as the user that owns all of the mailboxes. So we need to make sure that this user has these permissions as well. And it will show you the home and mail paths, which in my configuration are the same, and they should be correct. It should be going to home, vmail, domain, user, which you can see it is. What you don't want to find here is for the user to either not be found or for the user to be associated with a Linux home directory for that username. If that happens, then something is wrong with your setup and probably virtual mailboxes are not being used. But just to really labour this point, make sure that you use sudo, otherwise you'll get error messages and you might get confused. Make sure you do elevate your permissions before using the Dovecot admin command. So this is very useful after you've created a new user, just to check that the permissions are as they should be and that Dovecot has picked up the settings correctly. If this all works, it's a good indicator that all of the user and virtual mailbox settings that we did when we set up virtual mailboxes earlier in this series have been done correctly. Okay, so I'm sure you can see how invaluable that can be. The fourth point to try of the 6 is to use the mail and mut tools to send an email from within your server and to then check it has been received. They are useful tools to quickly check that internally email sending and receiving is working as it should, particularly for confirming the mailboxes are receiving the emails without having to go out and configure an email client. Here is a quick example. Let's use mail first to send an email. So type as I type, or at least similarly to how I type, mail, which is the command, and I'm going to send an email to Bob, so yours will be different, and it's bob@single-entity.com. This email is going to come from my user Pi4, but that's okay. It's still going to be using Postfix to send it. So bob@single-entity.com for me. I press enter. It asks me if I want to CC anybody, which of course stands for carbon copy, and I don't. Subject, I'm going to type in hello from the server. There we go. And then you press enter again, and then it's the body of the email. So this email is being sent via the mail tool at the CLI. Okay, press enter again to get a new line, and then to send the email, you do Control and D on the keyboard. Control D, and the email should be sent. So bob@single-entity.com should now have a new email if SMTP is working correctly. So once sent, we need to check it has been received. To do that, we'll make use of a tool called mut. Firstly, however, you may need to install it just to make sure you have it. So sudo apt-get install mut with 2 T's. So this is the tool we're going to be using. I already have it installed, but you may not. So do that first in case you haven't got it. Now we'll use it as follows. So type as I type, sudo mut -f, so we're referencing a folder here, /home/vmail. Obviously this is basically going to where the emails are. I sent an email to bob@single-entity, so it's going to be single-entity.com/bob, because we know that is the path to the virtual mailbox for Bob. Okay, press enter. Now, we had to use sudo because we need to have elevated permissions, as the mailboxes are owned by the user vmail, not my user Pi. And this is a nice quick way to do that. But the consequence is that mut will ask you here, as you can see at the bottom, if we want to create a mail directory in the root directory, because this user doesn't have one. Basically, root doesn't have one. So just say no for now, because that's not really what we're after. Okay. Once done, you can see your inbox in the terminal, which is pretty cool. In this case, I have the email present, which we just sent. You can see it highlighted here, hello from the server. So this means that I know that SMTP has worked correctly, and that our virtual mailboxes are set up correctly because the email has found its way into Bob's directory. So this is a great test for those two things being correct locally. So it's another thing you should think about doing if you're having trouble with your emails. So if I press enter, it'll open up the email, very similarly to how an email client will do on your desktop. So this is a great way of viewing emails on your server if you're in situ and logged into the terminal. Okay, so to exit this, we press Ctrl+C and then press Y when asked. I'll just clear my screen to get my terminal back to the top. There we go. Right, so that's the first 4 points covered. On to number 5 then, the Telnet tool. Now, The Telnet tool is your best shot at checking IMAP is working correctly from within your own server, and that your new users are able to authenticate via IMAP. It is very easy to do. In fact, we've done it before, earlier in this series, but let's just run through it now. So first, we open a session with Telnet on port 143, which is the port we use for IMAP. So Telnet localhost 143 is what you type. Once done, you'll get a status line telling us that Dovecot is ready and waiting for us to provide credentials. If this doesn't work, then it's likely that your IMAP server, Dovecot, isn't working properly. There's a configuration issue or something else, the server's not even running. But if you get to this point where it says OK, Dovecot is ready, then at least you know Dovecot is running. That's the first thing. Right, so next, we need to provide each subsequent command with a prepended letter of the alphabet. We're only going to provide one command, but we need to prepend it with an A. Also note that we have to provide a fully qualified domain name for the user, as we did with Thunderbird in the last video. So, type as I type, but substitute the username and password as appropriate for your system. So A space login, because we want to check we can authenticate with the user. You want to then create a speech mark. So you're going to encapsulate the address in speech marks. I'm going to go to Bob, just being consistent here, single-entity.com for me. Yours will be different. That's the username, of course. And then, oh, I should mention, when we did Telnet, when we used Telnet before, we wouldn't have provided a fully qualified domain name. This is something we're doing because we're using virtual mailboxes. If we were using the Linux user accounts, the login would just be Bob, because Bob is the user who is being logged in as. But now we're using fully qualified domain names, and I laboured that point in the previous video. Okay, so that's the username, and then you add the password. So I don't mind showing you my password because it's temporary, it's just for now. I'm going to copy that in from off screen. And you also want to encapsulate the password in speech marks. So that's all you need to provide for Telnet to log you in and authenticate you. So I press enter. So what we see here is that I have now been logged in, and therefore I know that IMAP is letting me authenticate with this user correctly, which is great. It helps you know that at least internally IMAP is working and authenticating with your new user. So I can now exit this. I'll just highlight actually to make it clear. This bit is the bit that's of particular import, and OK. Okay. So to exit halfway through a Telnet session like this, you press Control and then the right square bracket on your keyboard. So Control and right square bracket. And then when you get the Telnet prompt, you type in quit and press enter. Okay, great. So one thing to bear in mind is that it shouldn't work with just a username, as I've mentioned. If you're using virtual mailboxes, it shouldn't work. If it does, and you've got virtual mailboxes set up, something is amiss. So make sure it may be worth you making sure that the user Bob doesn't work, for example. Right, the sixth and final thing I do is, of course, to test emails through your own email client external to your Raspberry Pi, and I prefer Thunderbird. I won't demonstrate this as I did so in the previous video, but that is often the final test that everything is working, as it combines IMAP with SMTP all in one package from outside of your server, although you may be doing it inside of your network, and that's something to still bear in mind. So that's it. They are my 6 pointers for helping you narrow down and suss out the problems you're having. If you found this useful, it would be really nice if you could please like the video before you head off. And if you could subscribe to my series if you haven't already, that would be lovely as well, thank you. It's the best way of showing appreciation. Also, if you like one-to-one support, would like to support my work or get access to my videos well in advance on YouTube, please do check out my Patreon account. It's the only place I get any kind of support. Okay, great, thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.